All right, we are live and welcome to session number 3. John and Jordan here. And we have some interesting topics. So as you know, we always typically come from a spontaneous point of view. And it's really quite organic process of what we decide to talk about. But we do have an outline, an official outline for you today that we thought would just give us some structure. That outlines basically consisting of just a few things. Balancing intellect and intuition. We'll talk about some of the masculine and feminine, and then I might branch into some of the brain hemisphere synchronization. John really has done his work, and we'll be looking at energy and spirit in 2 different viewpoints. And then something also John's been studying. He's reading a book for a 3rd time. What's the name of that book again, John?
Love Without End.
Love Without End. And who's the author?
Glenda Green.
Glenda Green. And you said you're reading it a 3rd time, and it's just as fresh for you the 3rd time coming through and you're trying to connect a few dots. So let's see what kind of integration and synergistic aspects we can get. So welcome to this wonderful chat that we're having. So how have you been, John? You ready to get the ball rolling?
Well, we might just as well get going.
All right, we'll get going. So one of the things I just wanted to touch base on with us for the audience is really looking at intellect and intuition. And we've talked about feminine and masculine, balancing the feminine with the masculine. And I know that you and I definitely had the masculine and intellect down, didn't we, John?
Yeah.
But
yeah, although I'm learning that I have a pretty strong feminine side.
Exactly. And so let's just talk about that, step into that a little bit. I could do a short segue where just describe it. I had spent, as John did, a majority of my life in academia. He did it a lot longer because I ended up leaving at an earlier age. But developing intellect and really fine-tuning the intellect and the mind and building that part of the brain. And as you know, things always need to be in balance. And just a quick review, the left part of the brain is thinking in words, sequences, linear thinking, mathematics, facts, logic, intellect. And then the right part of the brain is feelings of visualization, imagination, intuition, rhythm, holistic thinking, and arts. And so they actually cross over. And so you can think about your dominant side of the brain typically being on the opposite side of the body, the left side, and vice versa. If you were to just put it into a label and parcel it out, haphazardly. But at the core of the ultimate potential of humanity and who we are, I learned that in order to feel whole, I had, as the intuition started flooding in through the awakening process and the transformational process, one of the hardest parts was that pendulum swing from intellect to intuition. And then when I was in intuition, I said, I don't want anything to do with the intellect part. I just want to stay in the intuition and the feminine. And then that was a complete pendulum swing. And as the process went forward, I ended up needing to integrate those sides of the brain, and that's currently still a work in progress. But I am understanding that you crystallize the intellect first, and then you can balance it out with the intuition and vice versa. What's your initial words with regards to the intellect and intuition?
What you've described is a perfect description. I don't think I wouldn't say anything any differently than you did. That developing both of these is fundamental to living our purpose, because our purpose comes out of the balance of the two. But when I think back on my own life, I, for some reason, and I think it had to do with my upbringing, I suppose, because that's such a dominant influence on our lives at the critical times when we're making important lifelong decisions.
Yeah.
And so I focused on the intellectual side, and and it was always very hard for me. I had a very, very difficult time. And my parents had to bribe me in ninth grade with money to make National Honor Society before I would start to apply myself to the intellectual things. I mean, I would mess around with it, but I could never do it very well. And I was a really poor student. I managed to pass all the grades, although I had some Fs. I had failures on my report cards. But then when they bribed me, and with an amount of money that was more than I'd ever seen, I don't think it was a lot to them, but it was an awful lot to me. And I started to really apply myself and work at it. And it started, for me, it started really in ninth grade algebra. And by this time, of course, I'm really behind in math. So ninth grade algebra is pretty hard. And anyway, I managed to actually make National Honor Society. And my parents forgot about the bribe. I mean, after all, this is 4 years later now when I graduate.
Okay, so they
National
forgot.
Honor Society. They forgot. But I actually understood at that point that what they did was a really smart, wise thing for them to do, because I was the benefactor of all of that work. And the money didn't seem like so much money anymore 4 years later.
That's interesting. I had the same thing growing up. My positive reinforcement was based off of grades and your intellect. That was what was reinforced. $20 per A.
Ooh,
you know.
Okay.
And so ironically, both you and I worked really hard to fulfill that positive reinforcement value in our lives, did we not?
Yeah. Another similarity we have in our upbringing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And when I went off to college, it didn't change. It stayed hard.
That was
in
your
high
survival.
school, I spent way more time studying than any of my classmates did. It kept me out of trouble a lot of the time. Because growing up in a mining town, there were lots of opportunities for trouble. It just was all around you all the time. So in college, it wasn't any different. It was hard. And I went into engineering, and then I didn't want to do that because I learned that most run-of-the-mill engineers have really boring jobs from my perspective. Which I didn't realize. So I got out of that, and then I didn't know what to do. And I went into physics, and then I thought I'd be a physics teacher, high school teacher. So I got into a program with a bachelor's in physics and a bachelor's in education. And then I decided I didn't want to go for 5 years. I wanted to get out of there in 4. So I just did the physics, and I didn't know what to do. And a couple options came up, and I ended up in grad school and eventually got my PhD. And it wasn't until I was working on my PhD that I actually succeeded in mastering the educational system and how to beat it, so to speak, how to get A's in everything. So in all my coursework in my PhD, I had all A's. And it took me that long to figure out how to do this intellectual stuff to somebody else's satisfaction.
Not to your own. And
not my own.
And you started out by struggling with 8th grade algebra, and I did the same thing. I struggled with 8th grade algebra, and then you chased that positive reinforcement. I can't speak for other people, but there was a self-worth involved with this external reflection through the academic system. My self-worth was reflected by the successes that were reflected back to me and not my internal state. Eventually, I had reached a precipice in my career where no longer was the external reinforcements giving me a joy. They weren't giving me a joy. And my soul evolution started to stall, and I became very hungry. My soul wanted to continue to evolve. And that's when the transformational process was directed. And all hell broke loose, you could call it, but
Yeah.
just this quick saying here, society has long valued logic over intuition. Now, bridging intuition of the heart with the logic of the mind produces a balanced consciousness, and this shift in consciousness is now upon us. So one of the things I'm observing now, we're observing as a collective, obviously, is that there's a new need to develop the intuition, the feminine aspect of the mind, of the heart, the intuitive aspects of the mind, the intuitive aspects of the heart, not only to synchronize both hemispheres of the brain, but to be in heart-brain coherence.
Right.
So you have the vertical relationship between the heart and the brain, and also the horizontal relationship between the hemispheres with the communication.
Mm-hmm.
So we're being asked to really tap into this intuitive feminine energy as the divine feminine's coming into the collective to balance that masculine out. Talk about balancing the masculine with the feminine. Well, this is the time to do it. And this is one way of doing it. And it's interesting to get a different perspective, a different one, more maybe a spiritual science perspective today on this topic.
Yeah.
One that you won't typically get in just a spiritual perspective, one you typically won't get in the science perspective, but to really integrate this from experiential and intellectual and intuitive perspective. So I think that's an interesting start.
Here's a thought for you. Maybe it just demonstrates how slow I am at picking this stuff up. But it seems to me like the intellectual part, the left brain activity, the masculine side that we do uses a lot of knowledge. It's a lot of knowledge and consistencies, logic, reasoning, this sort of thing. There's another aspect to understanding, and the only way you ever really truly get the understanding is with the right side, which at least now it appears to me that's more like wisdom. And so at this moment, I mean, I hadn't ever thought about this before, but it's just emerging for me, I think, in our conversation. And that is that the knowledge side of our functioning is sort of more affiliated with the masculine side, and the wisdom level of our functioning is more associated with the feminine side. And that true understanding comes from the balance of both of these in everything that we do, which can then lead to our true purpose. I mean, we have many purposes in our life, I think, that come and go. I mean, my purpose when I was in high school was a whole lot different than my purpose is now.
Yeah,
I mean, it's been evolving.
Yeah.
But this masculine and feminine and knowledge and wisdom, in this case, knowledge and wisdom interacting with each other through understanding.
Okay. Yeah. So it's the masculine and the feminine. I was just going to ask that. So it's the masculine and the feminine coming together that you would suggest produces the understanding.
Produces the understanding, and that understanding really then is the function of love.
Okay.
It's because the function of love is always associated with this exchange, so that two elements of reality become one.
Mm-hmm.
And so this understanding is what unifies the masculine and the feminine into a whole. And as a whole person, everything we do needs to balance both of those parts of our purpose, which to me, that kind of wraps up in sort of a nice little convenient package that is, I haven't ever thought about it that way before.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe this is, others have done this, I hope so. That it, at least for me, it ties this up into it helps me to understand my own life.
Yeah, that's what people are looking for, right? It's to understand their own life themselves.
Yeah,
reciprocity, and they're looking for understanding. and knowledge and wisdom, there's a whole thought process of, you can't really understand anything. What do you really, you can have knowledge, but do you truly understand anything to the level of truth? So that's a whole other thing, but I just wanted to throw that out there. And then there's also the wall of knowledge that you hit along your spiritual growth. Have you heard of the wall of knowledge that you can hit, where you can, for spiritual growth purposes, just specifically, you can clog your brain up with too many thoughts and knowledge, when in fact, by quieting the mind and moving beyond thought, that's where you can pop out of the matrix. That's where you can find that Buddha consciousness, that Christ consciousness, by not necessarily investing in the wall of knowledge, but moving beyond knowledge itself to another domain beyond thought.
And I think when you thinking back on research that I did as I matured as a scientist, the likelihood that a young apprentice, graduate student, for example, would get stuck was pretty high probability. That they would work for a while and then they would get stuck. And it's because the whole educational system has been left braining them to death. I mean, it's all about regurgitation facts. It's all about thinking through these problems, solving complicated reasoning and logistical exercises. And the right brain that doesn't really get much. I mean, maybe you get an art class once in a while, and if you're oriented like me, you avoided those things. Because you never could really do much in them. Well, when you're working with them, as you mature as a scientist, you realize that this wisdom side, this feminine side, is what gets you out of those conundrums, of those stuckness. Right? Because the stuckness comes from reasoning reaching an end of its utility. It just isn't possible anymore to work your way through this. You need a new perspective. You need to look at something from a whole different angle and come at it in a different direction to get yourself unstuck. And that was something that as an advisor, I appreciated more and more as I matured, because I could do that naturally. Because I was moving, if I look at my career, I was moving from the technical side, the knowledge and reasoning side, and writing my own programs and deriving my own mathematical relationships and writing the papers. And then you start with this left brain, totally left brain side, and designing your experiments, building my own instruments, all of this sort of stuff. And then as you mature, at least for me, as I matured, I stepped away from that stuff. And it was the students who were doing those things. And now I was moving more over into the right brain side of, well, where is this going? And what's best for this student? What will serve their purpose? They often didn't know what they wanted to do, or they did, but it's possible if you care about somebody and you get connected to them emotionally, and you love those people in a very personal way, that you start to see some things that will help them, and then you use those things with them, and you drop them hints, and you don't tell them what to do, because that never works.
No, it doesn't work.
It just doesn't work, because they're independent thinkers and they're independent people. But you can get them unstuck from some of those problems that are so important to them. Sometimes with a word or one sentence or one simple idea clicks in their mind. I mean, and suddenly they're on a whole different path, and something that gels for them. I mean,
so you would say this is empowerment through intuition and that understanding of the divine union of wisdom and knowledge. that you're
Yes.
applying here directly with regards to your mentorship.
Mhm. Because the feminine for me didn't start opening up until this transformation that I had
I was
in
going to ask about that.
1984.
I was going to ask. Yeah, mine
That
either.
was a sudden explosive birth of the feminine.
Felt so good though, doesn't it? Be balanced.
Yeah, yeah, because it was not intentional. I mean, I could claim no credit for that. That's just something that
Yeah.
just sort of enveloped me from who knows where. It was maybe because I had just pushed so hard and so long on the left brain, because I became successful and I could do things that I got lots of rewards for. And I think the left brain side is looking for rewards, and that's how it functions.
Yeah.
And that wasn't what was important in life. It's to find my true purpose. And it just exploded in there, and I stopped doing an awful lot of the nuts and bolts of being an academic researcher. And I started to automatically migrate to that intuition side.
Yeah. What's interesting for me is we can go into that, but you basically said your productivity skyrocketed after you integrated the intuition into your life. After you made this exploded in success in the academic system. Yet it's pretty much accepted that the system itself isn't an indoctrination process and belief systems and limitation to a certain extent. When you reach other levels and different avenues, there's obviously good apples everywhere, right? But there's also a training of the split brain, right? So you
keeping it split.
How much does the academic system invest in art? Now everything gets cut. The first thing gets cut. It's the right brain stuff and the academic and the institutions, isn't it?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Because I don't think there's any idea how you teach somebody intuition. Because a teacher who's going to engage that's going to have enormous humility. And I don't think humility comes from your left brain.
There's ways to get in touch with your intuition through spiritual coaching that we use. But it's a internal process. It's not like you're going to, I do it this way and therefore you're going to do it that way and it's going to work for you.
That's exactly right.
That's not it. Like you said, they have to connect the dots yourself through personal empowerment. There's actually no growth unless it's done by themselves. That's one of the things about coaching and all these things. It's good to have a foundation, but you have to find what works for you in your own path. It's just.
But how do you encourage that in our educational framework? It's so rigid, and it's so, you have one person at the front of the class, maybe another one or two people who can roam in the room as aides, and then you got 30 kids in the class. And you don't have a one-on-one, and it doesn't seem like they know any way to do this.
It's still, it's got to match the consciousness of humanity. It eventually will. But basically what you have is a destruction of the current system due to the limitation and consciousness moving beyond that paradigm and the building of a new paradigm. So ideally you would have destruction and building at the same time so that they offset each other, so they kind of and offset each other. So you don't have a too much of a void that needs to be filled within the infrastructure of society. So
do you see examples of that now in the educational system?
I saw education system crumbling when I was there. That's one of the reasons I moved on. My institution was a really kind of a example of a disconnect between the intentions of the faculty and the intentions of the administration, also investment. So what are they investing in? Are they investing in profit or are they investing in quality education?
Yeah.
And it became, as you said, we talked about the system getting too big before. We haven't on this series, but John and I have talked about in the past of how a system can get too big where it just turns in on itself. That there's a threshold to maintain a like you would say a balanced system. You were looking at the academic system as an organism, like you would the soil or anything else like living organism working together. And quite honestly, it's not done appropriately for the optimization of human potential.
Yeah.
Strictly, period. It's not developed for optimization of human potential. If it was, then it would have been, but it's not. It's designed to make you a cog in a wheel, to be a producer and a consumer. That's the truth of it.
Yeah. To make it uniform. So everybody has the same perspective on how things are going to be done, and it's operated from the top down.
And I saw corruption even within the curriculums, the books that they're assigning people. For example, I was teaching pathophysiology, and there's a particular type of cancer that just sprang up out of nowhere in a particular decade and just skyrocketed. And the book said, no known cause as to why it showed up. We have no idea why it showed up, but it's here. Well, it just took me a quick Google search and glyphosate was introduced into the food supply.
Biphosphate.
Glyphosate?
Glyphosate.
Yeah.
Glyphosate.
Glyphosate. My apologies. Glyphosate. Yeah.
Yeah.
So glyphosate, I don't know how to pronounce that or spell it periodically, but basically, yeah. So that was introduced to the food supply. And then to find out that even under a court, it was ruled that, yeah, it does cause cancer and you have to pay out all this money to these people, but then they still denied that it caused cancer, and it involved the federal agencies as well. And you just saw that they weren't going to accept that, and it trickled in, the politics trickled into the curriculum. And that was a direct example of me seeing the light came on at that point. And I realized that, this has been this way for
the denial is institutionalized.
Yeah, it's institutionalized.
And that's how the educational system is structured. You focus on, you think of elementary school. I remember when my wife was teaching in elementary school, all of these texts, all these things are organized in certain ways. There's a lot of uniformity in the elementary curriculum across the US. And certainly within a given state, the books they're going to use, the topics they're going to teach. And if you divert from that very much, you get some administrative pressure trying to push you back to the norm.
But they have getting an accredited program, for example.
Yeah. So I see what you're really saying here is this is the case where the left brain authority in this male dominated culture it tends to set up some kind of an ideal, like Plato said, in the Platonic solids. It set up some sort of an ideal and then try to ram everything into that. Try to twist everything around so it goes into that. And that's the antithesis of how the right side of the brain tends to work, the intuitive side, the integrative side. Instead of the differentiated left brain, you have an integrated right brain, where you can't break it into the parts. What parts does intuition have? Well, you can't break intuition into parts because that's a reasoning process to do that, to take some whole and then dissect it into its parts. And it's pretty hard to do that with humility and love and respect and understanding. Wisdom. How do you divide this into parts? It's pretty tricky. And it doesn't, and when you try to integrate it, you can't put it together because you certainly don't have any mathematical tools that seem to help you much in that arena, unless I'm really ignorant of that possibility.
What I'm thinking about is you could design the curriculum just a design the curriculum based on wholeness and balance of polarity.
Mhm.
From a perspective on balance within the human vessel and all the other bodies, 4 to 10 to 12, depending on who you ask in the yogic traditions. Balance the intellectual with the intuitive education. Balance the right hemisphere with the left hemisphere. Balance the brain and the mind, thought processes with the heart. Teach these things to optimize human potential. That is what the future needs to be. And you get the most accredited people jumping in on this, that would be ideal for optimization of wholeness that we talk about.
Mhm. It's interesting, the parallels here between the human behavior and, let's say, chemistry.
Okay.
Because in chemistry, when you have these elements and these elements combine into a molecule, there has to be a balance has to be achieved before carbon and oxygen can become carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's energy involved in this process. Either the energy is either emitted, so you put two things together and you get an explosion, and out of it comes a molecule instead of two elements coming together, or you have to put a bunch of energy into it to get the balance to occur, right?
Yeah.
So one way or another, it takes the presence of something virtual almost. Okay, that is something that's not material, something in addition to the material elements that are making up this reaction. You need energy in the case of a physical reaction. You need spirit in the case of people combining. So when you put people together, they're like elements. And a group of people together is like a molecule, but it's not going to form a molecule unless there is enough presence there of this spirit. And spirit is more associated with these wisdom components. Right? I mean, it's kind of like the parts are like the masculine characteristics, and the energy equivalent is the spirit in the human interactions. And so we need to have both these tangible things, and I tend to think of the rational reasoning part as the more tangible part of human interactions, human relationship to their environment. And that this right side of appreciation, of enjoyment, of humility, of integrity, that these qualities are necessary to have in order for people to come together into a unit that's a balanced unit.
Yeah.
Right? So that this group of people don't just become a group, which is banging all around, just like elements that come together and don't have the energy that's required. They just bounce around in there. They never really collect together, form a collective. Right? These elements never form a collective, which would be a molecule, let's say, in this case. I mean, and the same thing happens with people. People are like these elements. They're banging off of each other because they themselves aren't in a position to achieve a balance because none of them are balanced. All right. So they're all tend to be on one side.
Yeah.
And I wonder, for example, the degree to which language is a left brain process. At least for me, language is heavily involved in a left brain process. I mean, how I feel or sensations I get in my body from interacting with people, I haven't got words for those things. So language tends to be a left brain for me anyway, it's a left brain process mostly. And that right brain side of sensations, experience, feelings, emotions, those, the kinds of things I don't really have very good words for. I mean, you can kind of try to identify them, but somebody else's feelings are completely different. And the same word we'll both use, we have different feelings for them. So they're very personal things, but it's those are the things that provide the glue for people to stick together in a group and form a collective.
Yeah.
Where you have a group of people who are intimate in a way with each other in their interaction. And wow, they can accomplish horrendous things.
Like,
10 people together in a collective can change the world.
Through coherence.
Yeah, because the individual people are coherent.
Yeah.
And so all of the pieces have to be there. Just like when you have hydrogen and oxygen together, you have to have the energy there too, in order for for the things to happen to form water out of that. I mean, it's not enough to have the hydrogen and the oxygen.
Yeah.
It takes more than that. You put some energy in there, excite them, and all of a sudden you get an explosion that's even bigger than the energy you put in.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's the same thing happens with people. The same thing happens with people. It's not always puzzles me so much as this separation between science and this mysticism. I mean, because a lot of this right brain stuff is mystical.
Yeah, there's no
I think
separating it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, we can associate some words. I can say I feel good.
Yeah.
And somebody kind of knows what that means, but they don't really know.
Yeah.
They try to imagine how they would feel if they felt good, and they don't feel that way. So they think they aren't feeling good, but we might actually be experiencing the same feeling. You know what I mean? We don't communicate those things very easily. And what little communication we do oftentimes is not verbal.
Yeah.
It's with a smile, it's facial expression, the intensity of your voice, not the words.
The energy.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the energy, just like I'm getting wound up right now, right?
Yeah.
Just talking about this.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, it's good. Getting wound up's good. We'll keep it fresh. I do like to keep all perspectives available. So I just want to, just for the sake of the audience, really to state that polarity is essential to exist in the material also.
Yeah.
So you have the polarities are essential to even exist in the material. So you have a masculine and a feminine dancing around the neutral point, right?
Well, if you don't have the polarity,
yeah,
I think it tends to disappear.
It disappear. Yeah, it disappears without
disappears.
the polarity. So you need the polarity to exist. So it's not that you want to get rid of all polarity. It's about a balance of polarity within the macro micro that you're talking about. On an individual level, balance the polarity, have polarity, but balance it, and then balance that polarity out as a collective individual level, all the way from societies and the world to an individual atom, as they call it now, even though there's different waveforms of what we typically call the atoms now, more of a waveform, they're starting to think. But
no, that polarity is key, because without that polarity, you don't have change. There's no change. So long as we live in a domain that experiences change, it has to have polarity. That's the only place it comes from. And this function of love that I learned about in this book, Love Without End, is the source of change, because you have this exchange between these poles.
Yeah. Okay.
And the degree to which that balances, that polarity forms unity again, right? So it all came from unity, and then it gets split into polarity, and then the polarities interact with each other and form unity at another scale.
At another scale.
another
Okay.
scale of time, another scale of space.
Yeah. And we're,
and
do you think we're in the
so
process of that
it's-
right now, building up to another scale, to collective?
Yeah, that the collective, that was the hardest thing for me to reconcile when I retired and I wanted to be whole.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure why I was driven to be whole, but this bifurcation between my science life and my mystical life, they were separate entities.
May
They weren't together.
may I
They
ask
didn't overlap.
yeah.
Uh,
Did that
even.
cause pain, John, for you?
Yeah, it did. It did. And the only way I could deal with that was my work life was it was a vehicle, that's all. It was a vehicle for me to be a loving person. I had a sense of what a loving person is like and what qualities like integrity and understanding and loving and caring and joy and peace. And I had a sense for what all those meant to me. And so this was, so my science and my work life was a place for me to practice that,
Yes.
where I had this constant threat all the time that practicing that and focusing on that as the center of my life, was that ever going to produce, I mean, was ever going to produce enough to satisfy the system I was operating in in order to get my paychecks and be able to support my family and do, is this type of focus going to put the food on the table, right? And the
Yeah.
gas in the car's tank,
Yeah.
right? And I didn't know that at that point. But I knew that the only way I was going to be able to live with this split was going to be to live that way in this work environment that was all left brain. And so my motivation wasn't to publish papers and be successful as a scientist. My motivation was to be a loving person and to have these people to interact with that I could express that with them. And so it took a time. That didn't
I
just
gave you credit. I gave you credit
um,
because there's no way I was going to live a bifurcated life. And
um,
I don't think we should ask that. I don't think society should ask that. I think it should be mutually inclusive based on the system.
yeah, but it turned out, and maybe one of these days I'll
Yeah.
try to go
Blessings.
dig up that diagram on the publications, all right, and show you what happened
Yeah.
to all of the indicators of success in the academic research community.
Yeah.
They all flourished. And that wasn't my objective. My objective
It's
was
amazing.
to be a good person, whatever good meant, right? And so it was very important for me to have impeccable integrity, to be honest, to be direct with people, to if something came up in a conversation with somebody and it was a really, really good idea, I wasn't going to hang on to it. I was going to give it to them. Because generosity is one of the right brain natures, characteristics, natural characteristics. I mean, and so I gave away
and flourished.
lots, right? And then it came back to me many-fold in the end. It turned out that was exactly the right motivation. But for me, it was a survival mechanism. I didn't know how else to, because I knew that new center was who I really was. That was absolute for me.
What is that new center? What could you describe that new center?
Well, it's like the difference to be trying to walk across a spinning merry-go-round.
Okay.
And then stand on a rock.
Okay.
Okay, I mean, it was like standing on a rock, and if I stepped off of that, I was stepping onto a merry-go-round, trying to walk out the radius. You know what that's like. I mean, the
Yeah.
Coriolis force, I don't know if you've ever tried to walk across a merry-go-round that's
I
spinning,
used
but
to as a kid. I didn't know what to call it, but I knew it was difficult.
you usually ended up on your butt if you didn't have something to hang on to, sliding off of this thing. And then the worst one was the merry-go-rounds that were all flat and had no handles or anything on them. And then you start that thing turning and you try to walk across it and you'll be on your behind in no time flat.
So
I mean,
was
anyway,
that,
it's different. That's what it was like. Not
oh,
nurturing that center, because I knew what that center liked and what that center did not like.
okay.
Because when I did something it did not like, then I was just driven almost crazy mentally to sort it out,
Uh-huh.
to take care of it in some way, whatever way I could. I mean, and so I learned not to go there. I learned to trust that center, and it turns into a guide slowly over the years,
Okay. Yeah, come
many
back to some.
years.
How about for the audience when if they're wondering how to look within themselves to find their center? Do you have any advice on that? I know everyone has their own process, but we're talking about polarity. We're talking about integrating masculine and feminine. We're talking about science and mysticism. We're talking about intuition and intellect, knowledge as the masculine, wisdom as the feminine, understanding as the synergy of the two, functioning as love. And then you have the energy and spirit parallels as well going in there, that they're functioning in a very similar manner depending on the perspective of the person looking into the particular energy or spirit itself. When we talk about center, what could the audience think about when they're looking within themselves for a center?
I think that trying to think about this is for me was chasing my tail.
So going beyond thought.
Well, yeah, because I could try to think about what I should do here, what's the best, but no matter what I did, I had to establish some reference points for my thinking.
Okay.
Thinking always requires you to have a place to stand, and that's a metaphorical expression.
Yeah.
That you need to have some basic assumptions that you're willing to accept on faith. Otherwise, you can't. Otherwise, the thinking process doesn't work. And if you don't have that articulated to yourself explicitly, your mind will take a reference point. And for me, the reference point my mind normally takes is my survival, my personal survival. So if I don't identify my reference point for my thought process, it's a premise. I mean, every logic exercise, every reason exercise requires a premise before anything, which is an unprovable statement. It's just faith. At least this is the way I see it. And so I would go around and around with this, because depending on what I set up as my premise, I would think of different path for trying to address this center. So I think that I thought about what you're bringing up here. I thought about, what's the most important thing to me? And before that transformation, I didn't have a most important thing to me. I could kind of make it anything I wanted to make it. And that was always disconcerting to me. I mean, it was when I was a young Catholic, I kept trying to believe the Catholic information. Just the other day, we're cleaning out books here, and I come to this Bible study book. It was a little book I used when I was about 10 years old. a Catholic book for children, and it was, excerpts from the biblical stories with pictures in it, and that, to keep the attention of a 10-year-old. And that just brought back that sense of wanting something to hang that I could hang on to, that was
Yeah.
intrinsically important. And I never had that until 1984. And
One of
then,
the, yeah,
boom, just like that. Boom,
one of the
it's
interesting,
there.
yeah, one of the interesting things that you mentioned was, I could summarize as standing on your integrity,
Yeah.
that you had your integrity, and that was what allowed you to find balance with the mind and moving beyond the survival instinct. And ironically, having integrity quieted the mind and flourished, had your life flourish in a more balanced state.
Yeah.
And that was the thing. That was the one thing I could pick out that you were standing on. Is there anything you'd like to add on to that, or if that was correct or incorrect?
Well, that's true. But before the transformation, I could bend that. Okay, I could rationalize an option that was better for me than this wee small voice inside. It just
Okay.
wasn't strong enough. It's not that it wasn't there. It was there. It's just that I would bend it, right? And it kind of limited me. So I was never really nasty. I mean, I never was so far out of line that it would threaten other people. And that, I mean, that rarely, only 2 times in my life did that happen, where I actually threatened the life of another person because it got away from me. But most of the time that never happened. And I would just bend it a little bit, because I realized if I bend this too much, I'm going to lose control and I'm going to go into a rage. I mean, and then literally all hell breaks loose, literally. So I
Well,
could bend these things, but after that transformation, I couldn't bend them anymore.
so
Not one iota. I couldn't bend them.
what
I
was
had
it?
to just. What was this reference point
Yeah,
inside?
because I thought it was integrity, but that was already pretty much there. What's the essence of the reference point?
Its voice was loud, and the
Mhm.
consequences of not listening to it were dire. Dire. I mean, life-threatening for me personally. Until it was resolved, I mean, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't do anything until it was resolved. It was just merciless. And it was horrible in the beginning. It was horrible in the beginning, because I didn't realize this was the consequences of what I was asking for. Because for 6 months I slid into this depression, asking for a way out, asking for something to take me out of that. And then I don't know if I have any advice for anyone. I think for me, somehow I just needed something to happen that was beyond my ability to manipulate it.
Yeah.
I was born a manipulator. Okay. I know
Okay.
how to manipulate, and I learned to be really good at manipulating.
Well, that's
And
survival. You get taught
yeah,
how to, you learn how to manipulate to
mhm,
survive.
yeah, and I got good at it.
But
I
that's,
got
yeah, it comes down to a moral code, though, that seemed to be more in line with the universal law and
but
the creator's will, or God's will, or sources, universal law, energy sources, however you want to look at it. There seems to be a divine alignment there in a sense, right?
but I don't think that the rational side was so strong compared to
Okay.
the non-rational side, the emotional side or the mystical side, that I could behave in a way that other people saw as integrity, but internally I knew it was not.
Yeah.
But others others would never call me on it, and I would keep friendships with people I'm taking advantage of. I mean, and so I got really good at that, right? And I think I got to the point where I realized I can't get out of this by myself. I can't figure a way out of this. I mean, it's because the only references I was crediting with any uh, faithfulness or any trustworthiness were the mental ones.
Okay.
And at the time, I didn't know that the mind sets its own references. It changes them all over the place. Whatever is in favor of your survival, your mind is going to use whatever reference it has to use to do that, right?
Survive.
Yeah, to survive and thrive. And so I couldn't get ahead of that. I couldn't work around that. I just decided, either if something else is out there, either you gotta do something to me or something, or I don't want to be here anymore. Period. This is useless. This is just a
Wow.
pile of junk. I mean,
Yeah.
it's meaningless to me, absolutely meaningless, if there wasn't something that had more meaning than this, some connection somehow.
Something beyond survival.
Yeah, something beyond survival.
Everyone's stuck in survival. Everyone's trying to survive. And in order to make
Yeah.
spiritual growth, you have to move beyond fear of survival.
Yeah, and survival is fear.
Survival is fear. And then now we can segue into fear versus love, talk about polarities,
Yeah,
right?
and
so
that fear is all that left side stuff.
Okay.
Although there's, I don't know, maybe the right side has fear too. I'm still exploring the right side. I'm still learning about the right side. So right now for me, I don't have fear in my life like I did before.
Yeah.
And it's made for a degree of peacefulness that I could never have imagined in 1983.
Yeah. Was there a shift towards love over the fear of survival, of not surviving?
You know, the thought of not surviving was gone.
Yeah.
Because this center is so strong and so absolute. It doesn't have any rules. I mean, it's not like I'm supposed to do something. It's not at all. I mean, I'm supposed to be something, not do what I do.
Yeah.
I get to choose what I do, but that can't conflict with who I am. And if it does, it's unmerciful with me.
So when you were able to move beyond the fear and associated survival instincts of the mind, and you moved into more of a love, is that also when your career and everything started to flourish as well?
Yeah.
So ironically, just to take the point, the fear itself prevents you from, receiving what you are fearing not to have. It's literally blocking the actual instinct itself of survival, is blocking the abundance from coming in.
Yeah. And one of the things that happened that allowed me to deal with this, because at the time I was going through this, I didn't have anyone to talk to for a while. I mean, I was by myself trying to sort out what was going on, because I thought I was just going crazy.
Most people do. There's not a support system for people going through this like there should be, especially as the energies are increasing and more people are going to be processing this stuff necessarily to adjust to the energies and the new laws and how, to best navigate our lives are changing,
Well, yeah, I did finally find one person who was really important to stabilizing my life. And he moved me toward the Bible, because I had never read the Bible. Catholics, at least when I was growing up, Catholics never read the Bible.
No, mine, some do.
Yeah, some do, I guess. Well, now I guess some do, but then nobody did.
You just
I
don't
mean,
want to read the Bible.
no, we
I'm
had a
just
big
kidding.
Bible at home, one of these big,
Yeah.
thick Bibles at home. But that was all that had is a record in the front of it of grandparents and great grandparents and children and think, a genealogical record in the front. That's all it was used for. Sometimes the kids would be able to sit on it to get their chair a little bit higher when they were real young, so they could eat at the table with the family. And then, of course, it gets wet and things. So the covers were always kind of warped and things from kids not being able to hold their.
So you were able to talk to someone, and the Bible came in and scripture came in. I remember that. And you did at some point you did a spirituality and science talk for people, didn't you? And it went really well. Is that a different chapter
that was
later on?
That was much later. I think
Okay.
one of the things that struck me in the Bible was this fear thing we were talking about, because there's a verse in there, something like to the effect, and it's probably in Proverbs, that the wicked will experience what they fear, and the righteous will experience what they desire.
Well, that sums it up.
Yeah, it sums it up. But that really made an impact on me, because it was really pertinent to my struggle.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, it resonated somehow with this center, right? In fact, a lot of what I read in the Bible, not all of it, but a lot of it resonated. And I'd be reading, because I read right through the whole thing. I started in Genesis and read all the way through to Revelations, and then I go back and do it again. I mean, what would happen to me at times is I would be reading verses, and then pretty soon I'd realize for the last 10 minutes I've been reading the same verse over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And I read it so many times that I basically had it memorized.
Huh.
Or almost memorized. And I'd write it on a little note card and put it in my pocket. And then during the day, I would say it. And if I forgot it, I'd pull it out, refresh my memory. And I memorized a lot of it that way because they were verses that were pertinent to me. I mean, my mouth got me in more trouble with this center. I got to tell you, my mouth was the problem. And so I found some verses in there that would help me deal with that. And they had power. Interestingly, they had power. I would say those hundreds of times, many hundreds of
So
times.
like a mantra almost.
Yeah, like a mantra.
Okay. An affirmation mantra.
Yeah.
So that's what they call it, New Agers now. So you didn't have the New Age when you were going through this, did you? So
no, I didn't even know that term.
Yeah.
But it was really powerful. The Bible helped me enormously. And there was probably 4 years there. I interacted with people who were more fundamentalist in their approach. And that was a little bit too constraining for me.
Yeah.
And it just didn't work real well for me. But then along came another job opportunity, and I left and moved 300 miles away, for 300 or 400 miles away. And slowly you drift away from your friends when you move away.
Yeah.
But that center is not something that's easily explained. I think for me, I just went so far beyond where I should have been that it just exploded eventually. And for a long time, I wondered if I had, in fact, taken the wrong path from college. And it was only probably the last 5 years I've realized that everything was just the way it needed to be. It was just the way it needed to be.
So if we were to go from spirit and energy, go back to that parallel of spirit and energy, and kind of how one perspective will look at energy, the sciences, the other perspective, the spiritual perspective will look at it as spirit. But we've talked before in the past that those are the same, one and the same in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
Could we dive into that just a little bit briefly for the audience as well?
Sure. And when I think energy is a really powerful concept in physics.
Mm-hmm.
It's an extraordinarily powerful concept. And it's a very complex concept. It has many forms, dozens and dozens of forms of energy. I mean, kinetic energy, potential energy, electrical energy, gravitational energy. I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. And it's what makes physics so complex, is that there isn't just one energy. There's just myriad possibilities for energy. But what it is it's a mediator for material change. So it's
I like that.
It's the context for material exchange.
Mm-hmm.
And so energy is tied up in the function of love.
That's beautiful.
In this generic sense, it's
Mm-hmm.
tied up in the function of love. Just like spirit provides a context for the mystical.
Yeah.
Right? For even for a lot of these right brain sides, why is wisdom so valuable? Well, it's not that easy to explain. At least it's not that easy for me to explain.
No.
In some reasonable way. You can give it a definition, and we have definitions for these words. But what's more important is we have a context for these words internally and what they mean to us and how they affect our behavior. Then when I think about integrity, integrity can be a tyrant, right? Because if you start to push the boundaries of what this center considers to be your integrity, it's pretty merciless in the way it deals with me.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be. And I appreciate it. And it's changed my life. It's transformed me. So the energy seems to serve the same role to me in physics. And I've studied a lot of energy concepts in physics. It seems to serve the same role as spirit. I mean, if you think about the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit sort of thing, you have a source of some kind. You have a material component to this source, and then you have this environment within which it occurs. Mm-hmm. And I prefer to think of it as, say, love and fundamental particles and context, or maybe say energy or spirit. I mean, and so in a sense, you might think of love as serving two functions here. I mean, one is that it's the origin of everything, but it's also this function of love is to permit this exchange among these particles. So this Trinity idea is fundamental to physics. And energy plays the role that in the physics context that spirit plays in a mystical context. So energy is, we tend to think of energy as something that's real, something that's tangible.
Yeah.
And it's integrated into our economic system, right? Which means that if you can buy it and sell it, it's real, right, for us. But it's not. All you can ever see is a change in material, that's all.
Yeah.
A
It's
material
an indirect
that wasn't
indicator.
there appears, or a material that was there disappears. And that's all you ever can detect, because look at our senses. How do they work?
Yeah.
All right. Well, you can say, well, what about radiation? You know, it comes into your eye like this. Yeah, but what happens in your eye? Material changes in your eye. Okay, then they get converted to electrical impulse. Okay, that's energy again. And that conducts down a conductor. All right. And then,
Yeah.
but someplace there's a recording of something, right?
Uh-huh.
Someplace there's sentience, right?
Uh-huh.
There's sentience or awareness or these things. And we're not even sure what we mean by those things. We can have a definition,
I've noticed that a lot.
but every one of us has a different sense of what awareness means. And
Yeah.
some people have awareness capacities other people do not have.
True.
I mean, and sometimes people will choose to shut off awareness possibilities that they have. And so
Yes.
to me, I think of this energy spirit as a continuum. We call it energy up to the point where we can't really quantify it anymore. And we can still experience it.
Yeah.
And then from that point on and experiencing it, it's spirit. And where is this dividing line? I don't know, someplace in between. And for different people, it would be in different places. But it's a continuum. And it's very powerful. This energy and spirit are very powerful elements.
Yeah.
And this, I tend to think of this spirit component as simultaneously present with the material. Everything material
Yeah.
has energy involved with it, but it also has spirit involved with it.
Yep.
Right? It's got both of these. And you know, some people want to say, well, which one's more important? Well, that's the mind again. The mind's got to bifurcate everything. It's going to
Yeah.
try to
Pick
reduce
one or
it.
the other.
Yeah, well, doesn't have, neither one has to be more important. They're both important because put together they make the whole.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, so it's simplified things for me a lot.
I think that's a really great way of looking at, you know, mystical science or spiritual science, you know, as a conceptual framework.
Mhm.
That exists because you really have an interchangeable gradient interplay at every spot you're observing in the material with spirit, and where, like you said, that dividing line, or where they toss the baton from energy to spirit, you know, where's that fine line? Well, it depends on who you ask and the circumstances and nuanced circumstances, right? But
Yeah.
they're inseparable at a fundamental level. But it's ironic that society will accept physics terms,
Mhm.
but they won't accept spirit terms.
A lot of us do.
Yeah.
a lot,
Yeah.
a lot. And I think more people are going to be, because science is only coming at awareness from one direction. It's coming
Yes.
at the awareness from the sensory, you know, sight, sound, taste,
Yeah.
smell, touch. It's coming from the sensory perception side. But we know this other side exists, this thought side, this emotion side, this honesty side, this integrity side, this joyful side. We know that side exists. And science is trying to drill down and get there, right? And it has this presumption that it can do it from the physical end without
Yeah.
paying any attention to the other end.
Yeah.
And that might be possible. I wouldn't deny that that's possible. But the problem is that if you completely ignore the other end, you're going to destroy yourself before you get there.
That's where we're at.
Yeah, and we seem to be getting surprisingly close to that.
Yeah. So we're at the self-destruction phase of the polarity at this point.
Yeah, because coming from too much of either side produces an imbalance.
Yeah.
You know, when religion had control over people's lives, it destroyed them too.
Of course it did. Yeah.
I mean, and so this imbalance is very unhealthy. And, you know, you would think as scientists, we would realize this, because I remember when I was looking up references for things, you know, there's the physics journals and the physics, what they call the metrologists, study these reference points in physics. Physics has I don't know, 8, 10, 12 reference points. These are absolutes, where they're trying to define them to 10, 15, 20 digits of accuracy. And they're absolutes that they use to calculate everything, because everything's relative in physics. And you have to have references that everybody agrees on, that they work, and that you use them. And the whole world is using these same reference points, right?
Yep.
And they're always trying to put in a few more digits of accuracy onto it. Well, those reference points, they're crucial to the workings of science. That you have to have those reference points in order to function.
Yeah.
And I lost my train of thought.
Yeah. Well, we're just looking at the different reference points, you know, and they're trying to dissect it down decimal by decimal, and a few decimal points onto it.
You would yeah, that's what it was. So you would think scientists who have to define methodologies for these reference points. You have to define a methodology for defining what the absolute reference point is for a mass, for 1 pound mass or 1 kilogram. You have to have a method for doing that. And it's all circular internally, but it's consistent.
Yeah.
And it's powerful because it's extracting truth, so to speak, from the reality around you. I mean, consistency from the reality around you. So equilibrium is crucial to establishing these reference points. Equilibrium is absolutely essential.
Oh, so that's why
Right?
Scientists should know.
Yeah, and the scientists know this. I mean, you look at all the different branches of science, whether it's the mechanical interactions, thermodynamic interactions, whatever they are, equilibrium is the reference point for everything. At least this is the way I see it. I mean, in my own naive way. And so you would think, since physicists are so well versed in equilibrium notions and equilibrium ideas and balances and budgets and things, conservation principles, conservation of energy, conservation of momentum, all these things, that they would realize that balance is everything. And it doesn't stop with the physical. It's also present in our human existence. And we have these physical things and we have these mystical things. And we need to balance this stuff. Just like we have to have balance in which we define as an equilibrium state, because it might be a dynamic balance, or it might be a static balance. Everything might be stopped, or everything might be moving but balancing the way it moves, right? But it's still balance. Our reference points are balance, right? And there's inconsistencies in physics, and I ran into them in the thermal radiative transfer. I ran into some of these problems in the experiments we were doing, and why satellites can't do temperature better than a certain amount. I mean, you have an inherent error because it has to do with the definition of temperature being based on equilibrium, and you never have an equilibrium in these measurement exercises you're doing. So it's fundamental concept in physics, and yet a physicist doesn't apply them to himself.
No, well, we weren't taught to do that.
No, well, and that you would.
So that's the curriculum. If we taught people to balance themselves in the curriculum, it goes back to the balancing of the curriculum, if we taught people going through the process to balance themselves and that that balance is there, it would be, they would think of that. And then the physics would be balanced, and then the jumps would be made in a balanced manner.
Well, and we could progress in our relationships with each other and the environment and the life forms that we exist with. We could
Absolutely.
advance in harmony with them instead of in opposition to them.
Yeah.
But until we balance ourselves, each one of us balances ourselves. This is going to be a losing proposition for humanity until we figure this out. But we already know this. That's the thing that drives me nuts. We already know these principles and we use them all over the place in science. And yet, I mean, and yet they get ignored. When it comes to us, these same principles, somehow they don't apply anymore.
Well, it's easy based on how we were brought up in society to forget to apply the principles we logically know in our mind to ourselves. And it's
But
a
are we
really
too
good
close
reminder.
to ourselves?
What was that?
Are we too close to ourselves to see us?
That's a good question. You know,
That's
but
something that occurred to me in the last 10 years. I got to the point, I read a book and I got to a point where I could watch my mind work.
yeah,
And this was a transformational experience to
yeah,
actually understand that you are not just your mind.
that's the
Your
most
mind
critical
is a
part.
Yeah, your mind is a very important part of you, and you aren't going to get far without it. But it's not all that's there.
Yeah.
There's more to you than your mind, and the part of you that's your essence can actually observe your mind in operation.
So in meditation, I had a really interesting vision, and it was about the mind. And I saw an energetic version that it's like a Caucasian guy with dreadlocks, but had a bunch of like jagged energy around him, like plates,
Mhm.
these jagged plates. And I was like, oh, and then I realized that was some energetic work I needed to work on. And that was all the conditioning, energetic conditioning and upbringing and thought processes and egoic samskaras and all these different things coming around in the energetic body and the thoughts and the jagged energy that the thoughts can actually produce when uncontrolled. And then I realized, okay, underneath all of this was the smooth mind layer. So beyond all the jagged energy, the real part of it was this mental body that was smooth like a blanket that blended in with all the other bodies, wasn't outspoken, wasn't overgrown, wasn't conditioned, wasn't altered, wasn't unbalanced. It was just a smooth blanket, like the mental body, along with the emotional, physical, etheric. And it just was there unconditioned, beautifully in a flow state, just another blanket. It really wasn't creating havoc with the other bodies. And so a lot of times we find ourselves kind of in these augmented phases of these thought processes in the mind, creating these etheric energies that then build upon itself and prevent us from seeing the true function of the mind to begin with.
Yeah.
If you look at it as just another body that needs to be in balance with all the other bodies, things will start to fall away.
Yeah.
And I think if we can peel off the armory of augmented thought processes and fears and egos things that are teaching us to be in fear, and the fear, and then sprinkle some love on there if you can, like basically it's an interesting thought. It's a completely different visual, but at the same time, I think it is applicable at a different perspective. It's just we need to be in balance, and it's become augmented.
Well, the meditation is very powerful for that.
Yes.
It takes us to places that we don't go in our normal interactive state. That silence and contemplation, or I mean, whatever happens during meditation,
Yeah.
I'm not sure what happens there, but it opens up all kinds of possibilities that you do not have access to if you don't do it.
Yeah. The alpha and theta states and these different brain waves, and there's many more other waves, I think there's even gamma and delta and beta, theta.
Yeah.
Super, you have like super wavelengths too, that some of these meditative people have been able to get in. But we may be going down a tangent here, but I think it's just really interesting to see how, start wrapping up if we can, how this balance plays in every aspect. And one of the themes today was it starts with you internally, right? It has to start at the individual level. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
Even to love someone properly, you have to learn to love yourself properly first in order to project and provide that to another. And sometimes doing the inner work, there's some sort of hesitancy. Sometimes we weren't trained or taught, or, there may be some resistance from doing that inner work.
Or
and
it
it's
seems
hard.
selfish.
It's hard to, what was that?
It seems selfish.
Maybe it seems selfish, but it's the most loving thing you can do for humanity is heal yourself.
Yeah.
And do your work. And it seems like you've done a lot of your work, and it was really an honor to listen to your story today. And I'm really happy with some of the golden nuggets that came up today that they'll be able to address. And then we could always have maybe a Q&A follow-up if all isn't aligned. But
well, these are as enlightening for me as they are for you.
yeah, it's fun.
It's fun. It is fun. It is fun, Jordan, and you're just a real treat to talk to.
I appreciate that. Do we have any send-offs for this session for the audience?
I don't know, balance. I mean, how do you beat balance?
Yeah. We have what? Equilibrium. We have equilibrium, wholeness, balance.
Yeah.
All across the board, but it's kind of communicating the same thread, isn't it?
Yeah. Balancing the parts to make the whole.
Yeah. I like to say synchronizing the parts to bind that wholeness that's greater than the sum of the parts,
Yeah. Well, and we have such a good experience of wholeness because we're obviously one entity.
Yeah.
We're one entity, but oh man, we have a lot of parts.
Yeah.
Trillions and trillions of parts.
Yeah. So
we're still one entity.
We're still one entity, and we'll reach up on our next session and kind of maybe piggyback off this conversation a little bit. But in the meantime, really think about what equilibrium, wholeness, and balance, what these things mean for you and how you can apply them specifically in your life in a way that makes sense to you, and not to get bogged down in other people's definitions for words, but hopefully use this conversation as a way to look at it at a different lens, maybe one that's more in depth, but also one from a distance, allowing you to find that balance within yourself. So until then, we shall reconvene for the next session with John and Jordan. And have a wonderful time between now and the next session. Thank you and have a wonderful day.